and that gives a chance for politicians and for the public there in Washington, in the Capitol, to pay their respects all in advance of that state funeral on Thursday. Well, we were hearing from Rich Rubino, a political historian, shortly before we broke away to go to Donald Trump. Rich, let me bring you back in as we continue to watch these pictures. It was fascinating what you were describing, because you were talking about how perhaps history is being rewritten about the presidency of Jimmy Carter. He was much more complicated than perhaps many have given him credit for, certainly at the time as he exited the White House. As we were saying just before we broke away, he was this combination, was he, of a social liberal and a fiscal conservative?
I think he was actually socially more moderate, if you will. For example, on issues like abortion, while he said he was personally against abortion rights, he favored the law of the land, which in the United States is Roe v. Wade, which states that there is a right to abortion in the first trimester and the second trimester as well. So he was, I think, personally very socially conservative, but I think he was more. He didn't necessarily let that interfere with his political views. I think on fiscal policy, though, it's interesting because when he came in 1977, he said, "I'm going to try to balance the budget by 1981." Well, Tip O'Neill, the Speaker of the House, congressman from Massachusetts, liberal Democrat, wanted more Great Society programs of Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson had, for example, instituted Medicare, the war on poverty, but very ambitious social programs. Jimmy Carter did not do that. Jimmy Carter instead wanted more fiscal conservatism, and that was kind of anathema, if you will, in the orthodoxy of the Democratic Party. So consequently, there was really an internecine battle, and it all began, actually, there were water projects that the Democratic Congress passed, and they expected Jimmy Carter would have signed it. Jimmy Carter instead vetoed it and actually lobbied congressmen to sustain his veto, and he was able to sustain his veto with a lot of Republican support. So he actually worked a lot with Republicans, which is why it's so interesting today that a lot of people, particularly on the right, view Jimmy Carter. They say, well, he was a liberal. Well, in his time, there was a lot of anger by liberals toward Jimmy Carter, and that's why he had two major challenges when he ran for re-election, for renomination, and just barely eked by in 1980.
The conventional thinking, and you'll know it well, is that a one-term presidency is a failure. But when you actually look through what he actually got done, that historic agreement between Israel and Egypt, the SALT II arms treaty, the normalization of relations with China, the fact that seatbelts, airbags, that came in under his presidency, the deregulation of alcohol industry, the airlines industry, the amount of African Americans he appointed to the judiciary. None of those things have been walked back. They were all of enormous significance in the end.
Yes, absolutely. And it's interestingly, you talked about deregulation. That's something today that would be viewed as very much conservatism. It was conservative at the time as well, even though there were some in the left, like consumer advocate Ralph Nader, who advocated for that. It's interesting, though, his relations with African Americans, because he was governor of the state of Georgia, and when he first ran for governor, he only won 7% of the African American vote. He had said that he would invite, for example, the segregationist governor George Wallace to visit Alabama, and the thought process was that he was going to be a conservative. Then in 1971, in his inauguration address, he absolutely shocked the Georgia political establishment by disavowing segregation. And as governor, he actually appointed more African Americans to positions than all of his predecessors combined. He actually told some African American leaders when he was running for governor, "You might not like my campaign, but you're going to like my governorship." And consequently, African Americans really supported him. And when he ran for president in the very crucial Florida Democratic primary, he mustered the support of 72% of the African American vote in Florida.
I want to talk about him as a human being for the next question, because I was listening to one account from one of his sons who had struggled, who'd failed an exam in Latin, and Jimmy Carter then taught himself Latin so he could help his son. And then when you look at the lifelong partnership with his wife, 77 years, he was asked in one interview I was watching a couple of days ago, was it the proudest moment of his life when he was elected president? And without missing a beat, he said no. The proudest moment was when he married Rosalind. It was an astonishing partnership, wasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. And they met. So they met when they met when they were very young. The marriage sustained. For example, they had to move around a lot when he was in the Navy. For a while, they were stationed in New York State. They moved around. They had four children. And it's really an amazing life if you think about it. He was somebody who I think thought that his life was going to be in the military. Then his father died relatively early, so he had to go back to Plains, Georgia to run his what was a struggling peanut farm. He did that, and then he decided that he would get involved in politics. He ran for a seat in the state Senate representing Plains and the environs. He won that seat, ran for re-election, won that, then ran for governor in 1962 the first time, lost, then came back in 1970, ran for governor. You could not succeed yourself for governor at the time. So at the end of his first term as governor, he started running for president, and he was really a very obscure figure at the time. There was a poll, a Harris poll at the end of 1974 of the 35 that listed 35 potential candidates for the Democratic presidential nomination, and the governor of Georgia, Jimmy Carter's name was he was so obscure that his name did not even appear on the ballot. So consequently, him and Rosalind Carter went all over Iowa, which held the first caucus, all over New Hampshire, which had the first primary, and they campaigned. And they in Iowa they landed up coming in second to uncommitted, and then they won New Hampshire. And part of what they did that is Rosalind Carter would go all over the state of Iowa, look for antennas, if you can believe it, antennas, and then they would drive toward the antennas. Then whatever they were, she would knock on the door, and she'd find out if there was a TV or radio station. Said, "My name is Rosalind Carter. My husband used to be governor of Georgia. He's running for president. Would you like to interview me?"
What a great story. I'm going to pause you there, Rich, and I'll come back to you in the next
Okay.
few moments. But I just want to break in and stay with these pictures there at Dobbins. Let me just put the sound up as a gun salute just coming in to us. Well, there the gun salute, and of course accompanying Jimmy Carter and the casket, his four children, also escorted by the US Army Major General Trevor Brendenkamp, who's the commanding general of the Joint Task Force, and also Pastor Tony Loudon, who's the Carter's personal pastor, also travelling with the family throughout. So in the next few moments we're going to see the casket put onto the plane as they begin that final flight to Washington. And as I say that exactly is what we see